Hi and welcome to this breakfast seminar series, which is an initiative between the Teaching and Learning Unit and the Department of Technology Enhanced Learning. The theme for this semester is around the idea of using assessment to help develop independent learners. The rationale for kind of having a recording first is some of the feedback that we've got from previous sessions is that you'd like more time for discussion in the kind of face-to-face part of it. So we've decided for some of the sessions to begin with a short kind of recording which introduces maybe the main idea, and then to have more time for exploring that idea, discussing how we might implement it, or just discussing the idea in general. So the purpose of this particular recording then is kind of to set the scene, and in particular I'd like to gather some of your views around assessment, some of your perspectives, so that maybe we can explore those in more detail as we go through the series, and also to discuss kind of some of the ways in which higher education, as it typically operates, tends to create dependent learners. So the next thing is that you're going to be presented with a number of multiple choice questions, and as I said, I'd like to kind of gather your views, so whether you strongly agree with the statement or strongly disagree with the statement. So there's kind of a 5-point scale there, and if you would enter your view or register your view based on that scale, it would be brilliant. Okay, so as I said, the next kind of objective of this is to look at this idea of dependent learners. And often in teaching, particularly with my undergrads, we get lots of statements kind of around, look, particularly in kind of laboratory context, I've done this, what have I to do next? Or to the effect that I was missing last week, and I haven't a clue what I'm supposed to be doing, and can you tell me what I'm supposed to be doing? And even more generally, we would have found, let's say the last time, or I guess when we went through the modularization part and we took our kind of final year project, which would have been one of the main kind of things that we would use to evidence independent learning. And when we went through the modularization and ran it for the first time, we would have found that a lot of our learners really struggled with kind of the project bit, and kind of did the same thing that they did with lots of other modules, which was leave all their study and kind of preparation and work until the end of the semester, only to find out, of course, that it doesn't that plan doesn't work very well for projects, and it wasn't terribly satisfactory. So we ended up having to put in lots of structure to support the type of students that we now have, and one of those things is that every month we now do a project kind of review, and that encourages them to continue to work and provide some structure and all those types of things. And of course, we could argue that the dependence that our learners are kind of displaying is a function of the nature of the student that we get these days, and there is some validity to that when we think of increased access to higher education and changing demographics and things like internationalization and the impact that might be having, the maybe changing nature of some of our undergraduate students, the notion of the digital natives in Generation X, and the sorts of skills that they might be bringing to higher education, which might be very different from the sorts of skills that we would associate with kind of students from 20 years ago. And there certainly is evidence and a lot of discussion in higher education that if many of them are deficient in some key academic skills, and that does present problems and things like that. But I think we'd be remiss just to blame our students, and I think we also need to think about the structure of higher education, and who makes decisions around questions like what students learn and how students learn, the pace at which they learn, if and how well students have learned, how face-to-face sessions are conducted, what will be assessed, how will assessment happen, when does assessment happen, what are the criteria and who decides those. If you're late submitting an assessment, what happens and who decides that. And I would argue that we, lecturers and academics, make all of those important decisions, and that there are relatively few instances where students have an input, a role, or control over any of those types of processes. And that certainly, and to me, that creates a dependence. It really limits, I guess, what choices they make, which may be around, to attend class or not, to pay attention or not, to study and revise, to submit an assignment, to submit it on time or incur a penalty. And I think the consequences of this then is that, they are relatively simple decisions to make. There's very little complex decisions to make. And then there's and then maybe it's easier to see why this sort of dependence is there, because we have chosen to make all the important decisions around our curriculum and assessment processes and leave students with very limited sets of choices to make, and most of those choices are quite simple. So say take the last one. If we decided not to incur a penalty, then students might need to decide, when am I going to submit a piece of work? And if I choose not to submit it, at the sort of suggested time, what is the implication? Okay, I'm going to submit it a week later, but maybe that's going to impact on how well I can or how well I can prepare the assignment that's due that week. And maybe everything then that gets backlogged, and maybe they end up performing poorly on exams because they're creating loads of assessments. And while that has an immediate impact on students' performance, maybe there's a longer term lesson that could be learned by providing choices around some of the sorts of things that we tend to take control of and assume that we're the only ones that can make those types of choices. So sometimes by putting in these sort of rules and regulations, while they might come from a good place or with intentions, there may be with good intentions there may be longer term implications. And I think if we think of our curriculums and our programs, particularly let's say the ones that I would be more familiar with, which are kind of level 8, we have program outcomes around around learning to learn. So for our own program in electronic engineering, the statement around learning to learn says that the ability to manage their learning needs at both personal and professional levels, and to display understanding of and commitment to continued learning. And genuinely, I'd have to question, how well do we actually deliver on that program outcome? What are the sorts of things we're doing in our curriculum to support that? What are the sorts of things that we're doing, to develop that? The sorts of evidence we typically use is around our final year projects and things like that, which is evidence, but is year 4 the right time to start doing this? Surely we should be doing this in first year and developing this as a skill, and then that brings in a whole set of questions about how we might do this and things like that. As part of that, then we might be asking what sort of skills are important in terms of independent learning. And David Bowd has written a lot kind of about this with assessment in mind. So he's, for example, one of his papers from 2006 is aligning assessment with long-term learning. And in this, he talks about Preparing students for lifelong learning necessarily involves preparing them for tasks of making complex judgments about their own work and that of others, and for making decisions in the uncertain and unpredictable circumstances. And I guess what I'm saying is, that perspective to me stands in contrast with the sorts of decisions that we are asking our students to make in higher education, which are not tended to be very complex judgments about their own work. It's very simple: I'm going to attend or not, or submit or not, and certainly we don't tend to ask them to make judgments about the work of others, or making decisions around uncertain and unpredictable circumstances. So to me, that his views around what's important in terms of lifelong learning and independent learning seems to be at conflict with some of the views, some of the things that we're doing in higher education. So I guess that then leads us to the question: if we were to assume, as David Bow does, that one of the important skills is that ability to evaluate our own performance, for our learners to be able to evaluate their own performance, or to self-assess in some way, then how do we begin to do that? How do we begin to build that ability? When and where and how often do they need to get opportunities to develop and practice this skill? And what are the sorts of things that we need to be doing in order to support students to make accurate judgments about their own performance? And these are some of the sorts of questions that we're going to explore and discuss and present models of over the next couple of sessions. So I'm going to ask you to finish by looking at a final question around your views on, I guess, what I've been talking about here on this notion of dependent and independent learners, and whether you kind of agree with the view that I'm putting forward here, or whether you see sort of big holes in that argument. And as I said, one of the plans then in the face-to-face session is to look at is to explore that in a bit more detail, and also look at some of the things that came back from the questions around assessment. Thank you very much for taking the time to view this, and look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday.